Here we are, bit of wind, it's midday, the birds are too smart to be out in the heat, unlike us human beings who think we can control everything. Today I want to look at a philosophical and practical question which the Gaza slaughter highlights, and that is the moral superiority of the free world, in inverted commas. Because if there's one thing we like to think that we are, is that we have moral superiority in terms of authoritarian regimes, in terms of First Nations communities, that somehow the rule of the majority gives us this superiority in comparison to other communities. And it is the oil that keeps the war machine and the military-industrial complex functioning in the West. So we need to define terms. When people talk about the free world, we don't necessarily talk about representative democracy. When those in the West talk about the free world, they're talking about trade, free trade. What that means is trade without barriers. That's what the free world is about. Democracy comes in many forms. Now obviously democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, exists nowhere except possibly in the autonomous zones of north-east Syria. The rest of the world have what's called representative democracy, where you give a signed blank cheque to a representative to make decisions for you for the next 3 to 4 years, and you wait for another 3 to 4 years for the next election to decide whether you want the same group of people with the same ideology to continue. Obviously, it has advantages to a society where you have a hereditary monarch, or a society where you have a dictator, where you don't even have that ability to remove the leadership. So what is moral superiority? When we go to war, or when we support war, or when we support regime change, we're told it's the right thing to do. We're told that morally we are much more superior than other people. That's right, morally, you have this moral superiority. But when you look at the historical account and you look at what's happening in Gaza, you begin to understand there is no moral superiority. And the first 23 years of the 21st century have highlighted the fallacy that the free world is free, and that we have somehow a moral superiority or a moral duty to change regimes. Anybody who's old enough will remember the Iraq invasion. The Iraq invasion was an invasion against an autocrat, a dictator. But what has come in its place, as we see in Libya, in many regards for many of the people involved, is a much worse situation. We look at the situation in Afghanistan. Regime change there just caused multiple deaths, and no change 20 years later when the United States and its allies, including Australia, moved out of the country. So there is no moral superiority. If you look at the 20th century, The only country that used nuclear weapons on civilians was the United States of America in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And irrespective of how much sabre wavering there is about North Korea, China and Putin's Russia, the fact is, although they've got nuclear weapons, they have not used those nuclear weapons. While in the West we did. Then when we look at the adventures that Australia is involved in, and they are adventures, that's the price we pay for the US alliance. There was no moral superiority in the invasion of Iraq on both occasions, especially on the second occasion where regime change was implemented. There's no moral superiority in a country like Israel, which has extraordinary military might as a result of its alliance with the United States of America and its complete support. There's no moral superiority, and this was highlighted in the United Nations a few days ago when no humanitarian corridor, Australia abstained from voting for humanitarian truce to be declared in Gaza. We as a country abstained. 14 countries voted against it. Now every time there have been atrocities carried out by the Israeli government against Palestinians, and let's not forget, this didn't happen today. There's a history. Like everything else, there's a history. There is no moral superiority in shooting fish in a barrel or going to a fish farm to fish. When you enclose 2.3 million people, half of them children, and then bomb the living daylights out of them and send in tanks and bulldozers to finish the job, there's no moral superiority in that. And when you've got nations like the United States of America continuing to veto any United Nations resolution which stops the carnage, you begin to understand that freedom has nothing to do with free trade, and that majority rule without minority rights is irrelevant, as we just saw in Australia with the referendum on the voice to Parliament, which was heavily defeated, about 60 against and 44, when we saw major political parties come out, use misinformation, disinformation, to the degree that many Australians believed that if they voted yes, the Indigenous people would take over their homes. I know it's ludicrous, but that's the vibe that was out there. So there's no moral superiority in living in a so-called representative democracy, and there's no moral superiority in living in a nation that has extraordinary military abilities and has the ability to destroy the world over time and time again. And there's no moral superiority in countries in the West which were responsible for the climate emergency through industrialisation, now dragging their feet and asking the rest of the world to pay for their mistakes. There is no moral superiority. There was no moral superiority when regimes out of the West invaded the rest of the world in order to acquire their goods and people, in order to maximise their profits. There was no moral superiority in the colonisation of Australia, which began in 1788, when the British government sent across military and convicts to Australia, and the genocide began. And within 50 years, gentlemen of name and quality, that's right, gentlemen of name and quality, the dregs of the British ruling classes had squatted most of the land in this country, and were using free labour, convict labour, in order to expand their fortunes and oppress the British in England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, and oppress their citizens through the Industrial Revolution and the closure of the commons and mechanisation and displacement of people. There's no moral superiority whatsoever. And we need to forget that it's about moral superiority. We have no moral superiority. We have very little, apart from maybe technological innovation, to offer the world. And that's a dilemma. Well, somehow we continue to think that we are morally right, that it is right to inflict disproportionate punishment on people because of elements in their society being involved in a breakout. Then we have nothing to offer the world. We have armaments to offer the world. We have science to offer the world. But as far as philosophy, as far as ways to live, to somehow think that what happens in this nation somehow is different from the rest of the world is incorrect. Because in many regards you can draw parallels between what's happening in Gaza and the voice referendum and the dispossession of the country's First Nations people. And even 235 years later, we still continue to harbour thoughts that we will be overrun if we've given them a non-voting voice in the Australian Constitution. It was mean-spirited. It was stupid. It was ignorant. But what was important, it highlights the type of country we are. There is no moral superiority in ignoring what's happening 70 kilometres off the Australian coast in West Papua, where over 500,000 people have died in a continuing struggle against Indonesian colonisation and occupation, where the Australian government not only supports Indonesia in the United Nations, but it trains and arms the Indonesian military to contain the continuing rebellion in West Papua. There is no moral superiority in that position we have taken. And in many regards, once again, it parallels the position we've taken with Israel and Gaza, where there's been no understanding that history didn't start 3 weeks ago. The carnage we see has decades of history. There's no moral superiority in blaming the Palestinians for the Holocaust, because it wasn't the Palestinians who were responsible for the Holocaust. It was Europe. It was European philosophy, European ideology, European religions, which created the climate for the Holocaust. And today, Europe, and that includes Australia, stands back, where we see carnage of unparalleled proportions being meted against civilians. Disproportionate response. The Israeli authorities keep saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, it did. It failed. How could the Israeli armed forces fail to such a degree to prevent Hamas leaving the world's biggest jail, Gaza, and committing the crimes they committed? Where was the Israeli armed forces? Where was the Israeli Secret Service? The fact is that it failed to defend its citizens, and now it's overreacting, trying to maintain its status within Israeli society. There is no military solution. The atrocities in Gaza and the atrocities that occurred in southern Israel will continue to repeat themselves. And we need to look at history sometimes. Egypt and the Hittite Empire, over 3,000 years ago, battled for 25 years. At the end of 25 years, Ramses and the Hittite leaders came to a peace agreement, which is chiselled in the walls of Luxor. A peace agreement. And after that peace agreement, there was 60 years of peace, 60 years of prosperity, 60 years of stability. And in many regards in the Middle East, the Palestinian state and the Israeli state can coexist. They can coexist in peace. And the fact is that although there are elements in the Palestinian society, and these elements grow every day because of the atrocities that are occurring, that don't want peace, they want to see the complete destruction of Israel, the majority of Palestinians want to get on with their lives. And for us to support what is going on there, for us not even to be able to put our hands up to create a humanitarian truce, highlights our moral bankruptcy. And as a people, as a country, as a nation state, we have displayed our moral bankruptcy over and over and over again. Even a cursory examination of our interaction with this country's First Nations people up till 2023 highlights that moral bankruptcy. The fact that most Australians still believe propaganda highlights how powerful sections of our society are who don't want the status quo to be changed. And the fact is, there is no moral superiority in the free world. There is no moral superiority in the West. There is no moral superiority in Australia. Ultimately, until we learn this, and until we try forcing our solutions on other people because we think it's the right thing to do, we will continue to find ourselves in this situation. Moral superiority is an illusion. And while we continue to think that somehow we are morally superior to another group of people on this planet, we will continue to repeat the mistakes of the past.